Chapter 1, The Auction of a Soul. The gala at the Ashford estate was a symphony of clinking crystal and predatory whispers, but for Elara Vance, it was a funeral. She stood in the center of the ballroom, a vision in pale, shimmering silk that clung to her like a second skin. Her hair, the color of spun honey, was swept up in a sophisticated knot, exposing the elegant line of a neck that hadn't carried a sound in 3 years. In the world of the New York elite, Elara was known as the Silent Swan. Some whispered she was a snob, others claimed she was a tragic figure broken by the accident that claimed her family. The truth was simpler and far more haunting. The night the fire took her parents, it took her voice, too, not through physical damage, but through a psychological lock she couldn't find the key to. "Smile, Elara," her uncle, Thomas, hissed into her ear, his hand gripping her elbow with bruising force. "The Vane family doesn't buy broken goods. If you want me to keep your brother in that private medical facility, you will make yourself the most desirable prize in this room." Elara's eyes, a deep, stormy gray, flickered with a flash of resentment she couldn't voice. She was being traded to settle Thomas's gambling debts and corporate embezzlements. She wasn't a bride, she was a wire transfer. Suddenly, the room went cold. The chatter died down as a man entered through the double oak doors. Alaric Vane. At 32, Alaric was the king of the tech world, a man who had built an empire on encryption and shadows. He was devastatingly handsome in a way that felt dangerous, sharp cheekbones, a jawline carved from granite, and eyes so dark they looked like bottomless wells. He didn't look like a man seeking a wife, he looked like a hunter surveying a forest. He ignored the socialites and the power brokers, walking directly toward Thomas and Elara. His presence was overwhelming, a physical weight that made it hard for Elara to breathe. "Mr. Vane," Thomas beamed, his voice oily. "May I present my niece, Elara?" Alaric didn't look at Thomas. His gaze locked onto Elara's, and for a heartbeat, the ballroom vanished. He didn't look at her with pity or lust, he looked at her with a terrifying, clinical curiosity. "I was told she doesn't speak," Alaric said. His voice was a rich, low vibration that seemed to rumble in Elara's chest. "A temporary condition, I assure you," Thomas lied quickly. Alaric stepped closer, invading Elara's personal space. He reached out, his gloved hand tilting her chin upward. His touch was electric, a jolt of heat that made her pulse skip. He studied her face as if searching for a line of code in a complex program. "I don't mind the silence," Alaric whispered, loud enough only for her to hear. "In my world, silence is the only thing that can't be hacked." The marriage contract was signed in a side room, away from the music. It was a cold, efficient transaction. Alaric provided the funds to save Thomas's firm and secure Elara's brother's care. In return, Elara became Mrs. Vane. The forbidden nature of the arrangement was laid out in the fine print. Elara was to live in Alaric's secluded estate, maintain the image of a perfect wife, and never, under any circumstances, ask about the work he did in his private, sub-level laboratory. As the ink dried, Alaric stood and offered his arm. He didn't offer a smile or a kind word. "The car is waiting," he said. "Welcome to your new life, Elara. Try not to make a sound." The hook, as the black limousine sped away from the Ashford estate, Elara stared out the window at the disappearing lights of her old life. She felt the heavy weight of the diamond on her finger, a beautiful shackle. Suddenly, Alaric's phone chirped with an encrypted alert. He glanced at it, and for a split second, the cold mask slipped. His face twisted into a look of raw, jagged agony. He gripped the door handle so hard his knuckles turned white. He turned to Elara, his eyes burning with a sudden, fierce intensity. "Do you know what happens to people who break their silence in this house, Elara?" She shook her head slowly, her heart hammering. "They don't just lose their voice," he whispered, leaning in until his breath stirred the loose strands of her hair. They lose their soul. Because in this house, the walls don't just have ears, they have memories. Before she could react, the car screeched to a halt in front of a monolithic black gate. Elara realized then that she hadn't just married a billionaire, she had entered a fortress where her silence was her only protection, and Alaric Vane was a man with a secret so loud it was screaming. Chapter 2, The Glass-Gilded Cage. The Vane estate was not a home, it was a monument to isolation. Built from dark basalt and reinforced glass, it sat perched on a jagged cliff overlooking the churning gray Atlantic. As the iron gates hissed shut behind them, Elara felt the air grow heavy, as if the house itself were drawing a deep, predatory breath. Inside, the foyer was a cavern of polished obsidian. There were no warm rugs or family portraits, only the cold, blue glow of recessed LED strips and the rhythmic pulse of a high-end security system. "This is your primary residence," Alaric said, his voice echoing off the hard surfaces. "My staff, what few there are, will be here during the day. At night, we are alone. You have full access to the gardens, the library, and the conservatory. But the sublevel is off-limits. The door requires a biometric signature that you do not, and will not, have." Elara nodded, her fingers trailing over the cool surface of a marble console. She watched him as he moved through the space. He didn't walk like a man at rest, he moved like a soldier in a trench, constantly scanning the shadows. "I have arranged for a tablet for you," he continued, handing her a sleek, black device. "It is linked to the house network. If you need something, type it. I prefer the quiet, but I am not a tyrant. You will find your wardrobe in the West Suite. We dine at 8. With that, he turned and vanished into the darkness of the hall, leaving Elara alone with the humming silence of the house. Elara spent the afternoon exploring her cage. The West Suite was beautiful in a sterile, haunting way. The bed was draped in charcoal silk, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the crashing waves that made her feel like she was floating on the edge of the world. In the library, she found a sanctuary. Thousands of books lined the walls, their spines smelling of old paper and leather. It was here, tucked behind a heavy volume on Norse mythology, that she found the first crack in Alaric's armor. It was a small, hand-drawn sketch of a young girl playing a violin. The lines were hurried but filled with a raw, aching love. Before she could examine it further, a soft thud came from the floor below. Driven by a curiosity that felt like a rebellion, Elara slipped out of the library and followed the sound. It led her to a heavy, seamless door at the end of the basement corridor. There was no handle, only a glowing glass panel. As she stood there, the panel suddenly flashed red. A voice, distorted and mechanical, filled the narrow hall. "Intruder detected. Authorization required." Panic flared in Elara's chest. She turned to run, but Alaric was already there. He didn't shout. He didn't even touch her. He simply stood at the end of the hall, his silhouette blocking the light, his eyes shimmering with a cold, terrifying intensity. "I gave you one rule, Elara," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "One boundary. Do you know why I chose a wife who couldn't speak?" He walked toward her, the sound of his boots on the obsidian floor like a countdown. He stopped inches from her, his presence so stifling she felt the urge to scream, though her throat remained a locked vault. "Because a woman who can't speak can't ask, why," he hissed. "And in this house, why, is a death sentence. Go to your room. If you ever come down here again, I will consider our contract breached. And you know what that means for your brother." Elara fled to the West Suite, her heart hammering against her ribs. She threw herself onto the silk sheets, the silence of the room suddenly feeling like a physical weight. But as the clock struck midnight, the house began to change. From the vents in the floor, a sound began to drift upward. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the mechanical hum of the security system. It was the sound of a violin, the same one from the sketch. The melody was jagged, frantic, and filled with such profound grief that Alara found herself weeping without realizing it. She realized then that Alaric wasn't just guarding a laboratory. He was guarding a memory that was still screaming. She sat up, her eyes wide in the darkness, and picked up her tablet. She began to type, her fingers flying across the glass, but she stopped before she could hit send. Because behind her, reflected in the dark glass of the window, she saw the door to her suite slowly, silently begin to open. Chapter 3, The Language of Hands. The door didn't swing wide. It hovered, a sliver of light from the hallway cutting a sharp line across the charcoal silk of Alara's bed. She held her breath, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. It was Alaric. He didn't enter, he simply stood in the threshold, his silhouette framed by the cold blue light. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a ghost haunted by his own shadows. In his hand, he held a small, charcoal-stained sketchbook, the one Alara had found in the library. "The music," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "It wakes the house. I apologize if it disturbed you." Alara reached for her tablet, but then she stopped. The device felt too sterile, too digital for a moment this heavy with grief. Instead, she slowly raised her hands. She had learned a basic form of sign language as a child, and though she wasn't fluent, she hoped the intent would carry. She mimicked the motion of a violin bow, then pressed her hand to her heart, tilting her head with a look of soft, questioning empathy. Alaric watched her hands with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He didn't speak for a long time. Then, he took a single step into the room. "My sister, Lyra," he whispered. She was a prodigy. The laboratory downstairs. "I'm not building weapons, Alara. I'm trying to finish what she started. A way to translate neural impulses into sound. A way for those who can't speak to sing." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the coldness in his eyes finally cracked. "I realize tonight that I am keeping you in a cage of silence, just like the one she died in." Over the next week, the atmosphere in the estate shifted from a prison to a sanctuary. They began to develop a language that didn't require vocal cords or tablets. Every morning, Alaric would leave a single charcoal sketch on the dining table, sometimes of the sea, sometimes of the library. Alara would respond by leaving a pressed flower or a book open to a specific poem. They began to spend evenings in the conservatory. Alaric would work on his laptop while Alara painted. They didn't need to talk, the presence of the other was a bridge over the chasm of their shared loneliness. While walking through the cliffside gardens, Alara stumbled on a loose stone. Alaric caught her by the waist. The contact lasted longer than necessary, his heat seeping through her coat, his eyes searching hers for a permission she didn't know how to voice but gave with a steady gaze. Despite the growing warmth, the forbidden rules remained a jagged wall between them. Alaric was still obsessed with his work in the sublevel, often disappearing for 18 hours at a time, returning with dark circles under his eyes and a scent of ozone clinging to his skin. One afternoon, while Alaric was in the city for a board meeting, Alara found a discarded data drive near the library fireplace. She knew she should leave it, but the memory of the violin music pushed her. She took it to her room and plugged it into her laptop. The files weren't blueprints. They were videos. A younger Alaric, laughing, was seen helping a girl in a wheelchair attach sensors to her temples. As she hummed, a computer translated the pitch into the very violin melody Alara heard at night. But the video ended abruptly in a flash of fire and a scream that seemed to echo through the very walls of the West Suite. Alara gasped, her hand flying to her throat. She realized then that Alaric wasn't just trying to save her. He was trying to resurrect his sister through the technology he was perfecting. And she was the perfect subject. The forbidden connection was no longer just about a growing romance. It was a conflict of ethics and trauma. Was Alaric falling for Alara, or was he falling for the possibility of using her silence to finish his sister's ghost work? She heard the black gates groan open downstairs. Alaric was home early. As his heavy footsteps echoed in the obsidian foyer, Alara realized she had broken the most important rule of all. She had looked into the memory that Alaric had killed himself to keep secret. Chapter 4: Shadows of the Boardroom. The sanctuary of the cliffside estate was shattered not by a sound, but by a presence. The following morning, a sleek silver sedan, far flashier than Alaric's understated black fleet, screeched to a halt in the driveway. Out stepped Silas Thorne, Alaric's lead competitor and a man whose smile held all the warmth of a surgical blade. Alaric was still in the sublevel, buried in the data of his neural acoustic project. Alara stood at the top of the grand obsidian staircase, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was the mistress of the house, yet she was a woman without a voice, facing a man who made a living out of predatory conversation. "Ah, the silent swan," Silas Thorne purred as he was ushered into the foyer by a nervous maid. He didn't wait for an invitation, strolling into the center of the room and looking up at Alara with a look of mock pity. "I must say, Alaric has outdone himself. Most men buy a trophy that can at least thank them for the jewelry." Alara descended the stairs slowly, her chin tilted high. She didn't reach for her tablet. She knew that in this world, showing a need for a tool was a sign of weakness. Instead, she stared him down with a gaze so cold it rivaled the Atlantic spray outside. "I'm here for the merger documents, darling," Silas said, leaning against a marble pillar. "And perhaps to see if the rumors are true. They say Alaric didn't marry a woman, he married a prototype. That he's using your unique condition to test that little voice box he's been obsessed with since Lyra died." The mention of the name felt like a physical blow. Alara didn't flinch, but her hands tightened at her sides. The tension in the room snapped when Alaric appeared at the end of the hall. He looked disheveled, his eyes dark with a protective fury. "Get out, Silas," Alaric said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "I'm just making conversation, Alaric," Silas laughed, walking toward the door. He stopped beside Alara, leaning in to whisper, "A word of advice, Mrs. Vane. A man who is trying to bring back a ghost usually ends up turning everyone around him into one. Don't let him rewrite your mind just to hear his sister's voice again." When the door slammed shut, the silence that followed was suffocating. Alaric didn't look at Alara. He stared at the floor, his jaw set in a hard line. "Is it true?" Alara signed, her movements sharp and frantic. "Am I a prototype? A project?" Alaric finally looked up, and for the first time, Alara saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not fear of his rival, but fear of her. "I started this to save people like you, Alara. But then I met you, and the lines got blurred. Silas wants to expose my research to the board. He wants to claim I'm experimenting on my own wife to trigger a hostile takeover." That night, the conflict reached a boiling point. Alaric received a notification: Silas had leaked a distorted version of Alara's medical history to the press. By morning, the world would view their marriage as a billionaire's twisted experiment on a helpless woman. Alaric began to pack a bag, his movements frantic. "I have to get you out of here. If the board comes, they'll take you for questioning. I can't let them treat you like a piece of evidence." But Alara didn't move toward the door. She walked toward the sub-level entrance, the one place she was forbidden to go. She placed her hand on the glass panel. It flashed red, but she didn't pull away. She turned to Alaric and pointed to her throat, then to the door. She wasn't asking for permission anymore, she was demanding to be part of the solution. "You want me to use the tech?" Alaric whispered, his voice trembling. "It's not ready. It's invasive. It could cause permanent neurological damage." Elara took his hand and placed it over her heart. She didn't need words to tell him that the damage of silence was already permanent. If Silas Thorne wanted a prototype, she would give him a miracle. She would find her voice, not to bring back Lyra, but to save the man who had accidentally found a way into her locked world. As they descended into the cold, blue light of the laboratory, the forbidden nature of their marriage vanished. They were no longer a billionaire and his silent wife, they were two people standing on the edge of a tragedy, hoping that a leap into the unknown would finally set them free. Chapter 5. The Memory in the Music. The sublevel of the Vane estate was a cathedral of cold light and humming servers. Unlike the sterile obsidian of the floors above, this room felt alive, not with blood and bone, but with electricity and intention. In the center of the room sat a high-backed chair surrounded by delicate, silver-wired sensors that looked more like a crown of thorns than a medical breakthrough. Alaric moved with a haunted precision, his hands trembling as he prepped the interface. "Lyra was the first," he whispered, his voice echoing in the metallic space. "She had a degenerative condition that robbed her of her motor skills, then her voice. I promised her I'd give her the music back. But the night of the fire, the system overloaded. I was so focused on the data that I didn't see the cooling unit failing." He looked at Elara, his eyes wet with the memory. "The unspoken vow wasn't just to stay quiet, Elara. It was my vow to never fail again. If I do this to you, and the surge is too high." Elara stepped into the circle of the chair. She didn't wait for him to finish. She took his hand and placed it on the silver sensors, then pointed to her own heart. She was telling him that she wasn't just a subject, she was a partner. She wasn't Lyra, and this wasn't the past. As Alaric lowered the headset onto Elara's temples, the world began to dissolve into a symphony of static. This was the forbidden truth. Alaric's technology worked by reading the subconscious imagery associated with words and translating them into sound. The sensors mapped Elara's neural pathways, seeking the blocked signal where her trauma resided. In her mind's eye, Elara didn't see code. She saw the fire. She saw her parents' faces. For 3 years, she had kept these memories behind a dam. Now, the machine was breaking it. A low, rhythmic thrumming filled the room. It wasn't a voice yet, it was a heartbeat. The machine was playing the sound of Elara's soul. Alaric watched the monitors, his face pale. "Your brain is fighting it, Elara. You have to let go of the fear. You have to want to be heard more than you want to stay safe." Chapter 5. The Memory in the Music. The sublevel of the Vane estate was a cathedral of cold light and humming servers. Unlike the sterile obsidian of the floors above, this room felt alive, not with blood and bone, but with electricity and intention. In the center of the room sat a high-backed chair surrounded by delicate, silver-wired sensors that looked more like a crown of thorns than a medical breakthrough. Alaric moved with a haunted precision, his hands trembling as he prepped the interface. "Lyra was the first," he whispered, his voice echoing in the metallic space. "She had a degenerative condition that robbed her of her motor skills, then her voice. I promised her I'd give her the music back. But the night of the fire, the system overloaded. I was so focused on the data that I didn't see the cooling unit failing." He looked at Elara, his eyes wet with the memory. "The unspoken vow wasn't just to stay quiet, Elara. It was my vow to never fail again. If I do this to you, and the surge is too high." Elara stepped into the circle of the chair. She didn't wait for him to finish. She took his hand and placed it on the silver sensors, then pointed to her own heart. She was telling him that she wasn't just a subject, she was a partner. She wasn't Lyra, and this wasn't the past. As Alaric lowered the headset onto Alara's temples, the world began to dissolve into a symphony of static. This was the forbidden truth. Alaric's technology worked by reading the subconscious imagery associated with words and translating them into sound. The sensors mapped Alara's neural pathways, seeking the blocked signal where her trauma resided. The visualization, in her mind's eye, Alara didn't see code. She saw the fire. She saw her parents' faces. For 3 years, she had kept these memories behind a dam. Now, the machine was breaking it. A low, rhythmic thrumming filled the room. It wasn't a voice yet, it was a heartbeat. The machine was playing the sound of Alara's soul. Alaric watched the monitors, his face pale. Your brain is fighting it, Alara. You have to let go of the fear. You have to want to be heard more than you want to stay safe. As the synchronization reached 80%, the audio output shifted. It wasn't a violin anymore. It was a voice, faint, distorted, and layered with 1,000 echoes. Help, can't, see. It wasn't Alara's voice. It was Lyra's. The machine had stored the final neural imprints of Alaric's sister from the night of the fire. Alara's own mind was inadvertently unlocking the ghost trapped in the hardware. Alaric froze, the color draining from his lips. He reached for the emergency shut-off, his hand hovering over the button. Hearing his sister's final moments was a torture he hadn't prepared for. But Alara reached out, grabbing his wrist. Her eyes were wide, filled with a sudden, piercing clarity. She realized that Alaric's project wasn't just about giving people a voice, it was his way of keeping his sister's final words on a loop. He was stuck in a cosmic loop of his own making, and the only way out was to finish the translation. Alara closed her eyes and pushed. She didn't push through the machine. She pushed through her own grief. She offered her own voice, the one she had hidden away, to merge with the fragments of Lyra's. The lab was suddenly filled with a sound so pure it shattered a glass beaker on a nearby desk. It was a chord, rich, resonant, and heartbreakingly beautiful. It was the sound of a voice being born from the ashes of 2 different tragedies. But the triumph was short-lived. The security monitors on the wall flashed crimson. Silas Thorne hadn't waited for the morning news. He was at the black gates, and he wasn't alone. He had brought the board of directors and a tactical team, claiming he had evidence of an illegal human experiment in progress. We're out of time, Alaric hissed, his eyes darting between the door and Alara, who was still wired into the machine. If they find you like this, they'll say I've lobotomized you. The forbidden secret was about to be dragged into the light, and for the first time, Alara realized that having a voice might be more dangerous than staying silent. Chapter 7, The Silent Witness. The Vane Medical Center was a fortress of white light and sterile silence. Alara lay in a private suite on the top floor, surrounded by humming machines that monitored a mind the doctors claimed was dormant. To the world, she was a vegetable, a tragic casualty of Alaric Vane's obsession. But inside, Alara was screaming. The abrupt disconnection hadn't erased her, it had pushed her consciousness into a deep, secondary layer of her own mind. She could hear everything, the squeak of the nurse's shoes, the distant chime of elevators, and most importantly, the hushed conversations of the man who sat by her bed every evening. Silas Thorne didn't visit to mourn. He visited to gloat. You're a masterpiece, Alara, Silas whispered one evening, his voice dripping with a cold, oily satisfaction. He didn't know that her brain was recording every word. Alaric thinks he lost you, but he actually gave me the perfect vault. Those encryption keys are locked in your subconscious. Once my neurologists find a way to bypass your trauma, I won't just own Vane Enterprises, I'll own the global communication grid. He leaned closer, the scent of his expensive cologne nauseating her. And the best part? Your accident has turned the public against Alaric so completely that he'll be in a federal prison by the end of the month. I've even managed to frame him for the fire that killed his parents. A clean sweep. Elara felt a surge of white-hot rage. It was the first time she had felt anything since the lab. The anger acted like a spark in the darkness of her mind, illuminating the neural acoustic pathways Alaric had built. She realized she wasn't just a witness. She was a bridge. While her body remained still, Elara began to experiment with the echo of the interface that was still embedded in her neural patterns. She couldn't speak, and she couldn't move her limbs, but she could influence the electronic environment around her. She focused her mind on the rhythm of the violin melody. Slowly, the heart rate monitor beside her bed began to beep in time with the song. When a nurse brought in a tablet to update her chart, Elara pushed a fragment of her memory, the image of Silas's offshore ledger she had seen in the warehouse, into the hospital's local network. She knew Alaric was under house arrest, monitored by the very technology he had created. She searched for a backdoor in the hospital's smart glass windows, trying to send a pulse that only his receivers would pick up. Back at the estate, Alaric sat in his darkened library, a broken man. He was surrounded by legal papers and the haunting silence he had once cherished. Suddenly, his own tablet, the one linked to Elara, began to vibrate. It wasn't a message. It was a sound. A single, pure chord that he recognized instantly. It was the same chord they had created in the lab right before the breach. Alaric. The voice was faint, barely more than a digital ghost, but it was hers. She wasn't gone. She was fighting back from inside the enemy's camp. Elara? He whispered, his heart leaping into his throat. The screen flickered, showing a series of rapid-fire images, a medical chart, a signature from Silas Thorne, and a GPS coordinate for a server farm in the Hudson Valley. She was giving him the evidence he needed to expose Silas's fraud and the frame-up regarding the fire. But the connection was fragile. Silas's team was already noticing the glitches in the hospital systems. "Stay with me, Elara," Alaric begged, his fingers flying across the keys as he began to trace the signal. "I'm coming for you. I don't care about the board or the company. I'm bringing you home," with Silas Thorne entering Elara's room, looking suspicious. He notices the heart monitor's rhythmic beeping. His eyes narrow. He realizes that the silent swan might be a far more dangerous witness than he ever imagined. He reaches for a sedative, intending to silence her forever. Chapter 8. A voice found. The annual Vane Gala was not just a party, it was a coronation. Silas Thorne stood on the stage of the grand ballroom, the very place where Elara had been sold months ago. To the investors and the cameras, he was the hero who had rescued Vane Enterprises from a madman. Behind him, a massive digital screen displayed Alaric's arrest warrant and the evidence of his corporate crimes. "Tonight, we close a dark chapter," Silas announced, his voice smooth and triumphant. "And we look forward to a future of stability. Unfortunately, Mrs. Vane remains in a delicate state, but we ensure she is receiving." The lights in the ballroom flickered, then died. A heavy, rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate through the floorboards. It was a sound that made the guests' chests ache, a heartbeat, amplified through the 1,000-point surround sound system. On the massive screen, Silas's face was replaced by a live feed from the hospital. Alaric hadn't come with lawyers. He had come with a signal. Having escaped house arrest with Leonard Vance's help, he sat in a van outside the gala, his fingers flying across a customized deck. He had patched Elara's neural stream directly into the gala's broadcast network. "You have to do it now, Elara," Alaric whispered into his headset. "The world is watching. Show them who Silas Thorne really is." Inside the hospital room, Silas's private security team lunged for Alara's bed, but they were stopped by the state police. Leonard Vance stepped out of the shadows, a warrant for Silas's arrest in his hand. But the real battle was happening in Alara's mind. In the darkness of her consciousness, Alara stood before the locked door of her trauma once more. She saw the fire. She saw the moment she chose to be silent to survive the pain. She saw Lyra's face, not as a digital ghost, but as a sister. "It's okay to let go," the memory whispered. Alara tapped into the neural acoustic interface one last time. She didn't just want to send data, she wanted to speak. She pushed against the 3-year-old dam in her throat with everything she had. In the gala ballroom, the screen changed again. It showed the ledger of Silas's offshore accounts, the recordings of his gloating in the hospital room, and the forensic proof that he had sabotaged the Vane Gallery fire years ago. The crowd gasped. Silas turned pale, his eyes darting for an exit. "This is a trick. A deep fake." Then, the speakers emitted a sound that silenced the entire city. It wasn't a computer voice. It was raw, human, and shaking with 3 years of suppressed emotion. "It is not a trick." The voice echoed through the ballroom, through the hospital, and through every television in New York. It was Alara. Her voice was husky and unpracticed, but it carried the weight of a thunderclap. "Silas Thorne is a murderer," she continued, her voice growing stronger with every word. "He killed Lyra. He tried to kill me. And he lied, to all of you." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Silas tried to flee the stage, but he was intercepted by officers. The silent swan hadn't just spoken, she had sung a song of justice that brought an empire to its knees. Back at the hospital, Alara opened her eyes. They weren't vacant anymore. They were bright with tears. She looked toward the door just as Alaric burst in, breathless and disheveled. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He fell to his knees beside her bed, burying his face in her hand. Alara reached out, her fingers trembling as she stroked his hair. She took a deep, shaky breath, her vocal cords finally feeling like they belonged to her again. "Alaric," she whispered. It was soft, barely a breath, but it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. The forbidden marriage, the corporate war, and the ghosts of the past were gone. In their place was a man, a woman, and the beautiful, terrifying reality of a future where nothing was left unspoken. Chapter 9, The Vow of Truth. The dust of the scandal finally settled over Manhattan, but the world it left behind was unrecognizable. Silas Thorne was facing a lifetime behind bars, and the Vane board of directors had been purged of every soul who had turned a blind eye to his corruption. But for Alaric and Alara, the real victory wasn't found in a courtroom or a stock ticker. It was found in the quiet mornings at the Cliffside estate. 6 months after the gala, the house of obsidian and glass had been transformed. Soft rugs now covered the cold stone floors, and the forbidden sublevel had been decommissioned, its technology donated to a global foundation for nonverbal communication research. The estate was no longer a fortress, it was a home. Alara stood in a conservatory, the morning sun bathing her in a warm, golden light. She was no longer the silent swan dressed in morning silks. She wore a simple white sundress, her hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders. She was painting a canvas, not of the stormy sea, but of a garden in full bloom. "The foundation called," Alaric said, stepping into the room. He looked younger, the sharp, defensive edges of his personality softened by peace. "The first child used the interface yesterday. A 6-year-old girl in Chicago. She told her mother she loved her for the first time." Alara turned, a radiant smile lighting up her face. She didn't reach for a tablet. She didn't even use sign language. "That's the best news we've had all year," she said. Her voice was still slightly husky, a beautiful, unique texture that reminded Alaric every day of the strength she possessed. Alaric walked over, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her close. "I used to think that hearing a voice was the goal. I was wrong. The goal was finding someone worth listening to. And I used to think silence was my only safety," Elara whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "But you taught me that the right person makes the world quiet enough that you don't have to hide anymore." They held a second ceremony that afternoon, on the very cliffside where Elara had once felt like a prisoner. There were no lawyers, no contracts, and no business mergers. It was just the two of them, with Elara's brother, now fully recovered and standing tall, beside them. As the waves crashed against the rocks below, Alaric took Elara's hands in his. "I, Alaric Vane, take you, Elara, not as a contract or a partner in business, but as my heart. I promise to listen to your words, your silences, and everything in between. No more secrets. No more locked doors." Elara looked into his dark eyes, her own brimming with happy tears. "I, Elara Vance, take you, Alaric, as my voice and my home. I promise to speak my truth to you, even when it's hard, and to never let the shadows of the past dim the light we've found together." When they kissed, it wasn't the desperate act of two people clinging to a life raft. It was the beginning of a long, loud, and beautiful life. The billionaire's silent wife was gone. In her place stood a woman who had found her voice and used it to change the world. What a journey! From the heartbreaking silence of trauma to a voice that brought down an empire, Elara and Alaric showed us that true love isn't about fixing someone, it's about standing by them until they find the strength to fix themselves. What was your favorite moment of the story? Was it the first time they connected through art, or the powerful moment Elara spoke at the gala? Let's talk about it in the comments. I love hearing your thoughts on these twists and turns. If this story moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs a reminder that their voice matters. And if you want to hear more unique, captivating tales like this one, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thank you for listening to The Billionaire's Silent Wife. Remember, your silence doesn't define you, but your truth will set you free. See you in the next story.